So I managed to find this Beelink mini PC on sale on Amazon for around $320, and the specs of it were actually surprisingly impressive for the value here. In terms of the specs, we're looking at a Ryzen 5 5560U, 16 gigabytes of DDR4 SODIMM RAM running at 3200 mega transfers, and a 500 gigabyte M.2 NVMe SSD. Now it also has Wi-Fi 6E support, which is actually a surprising feature to see on something so budget here. And the specs that we get here overall make this an actually very interesting package. And really, you get a system that not only will be able to do some pretty decent levels of gaming, but you also get something that can actually be used as a home server. Now, opening up the box, we get the accessory kit here, which you can see actually comes with a spare SATA ribbon cable, and it actually comes with a mounting bracket so that you can actually mount this on anything. And it comes with two HDMI cables, one being a tiny one. And I actually really like this because if you have a monitor to mount this on the back of, it's actually a very useful cable to have because you can just hook it up without having a whole cable dangling there. So really, that is pretty much all that comes in here, of course, with the power brick as well, which is a pretty decent sized one. Not too big of a fan of the design of it because it actually does take up a lot of space, but if we actually get the system out of the box here, it is a very, very nice size. Really, it's nothing too unique in terms of what we've seen from mini PCs before. If you've ever kept track of the mini PC industry, they're all relatively around this size. It's really around the size of what you would expect from an Intel NUC, except that we're talking about some pretty decent levels of performance here because it is, of course, a 6-core 12-thread CPU paired with 16 gigabytes of RAM. You can get some really nice levels of performance out of this, and it's not out of the question to think that you can make yourself a home server with this specific box here. We do, of course, get two front USB 3s and a USB-C. I will be testing to see what is the maximum capacity of that front USB-C. We also get the power button and a headphone jack, and it does have a clear CMOS button in the front. Of course, underneath, it actually does give you some nice information on what to do for accessing things like the BIOS. So it's nice info to have there, but nothing too remarkable, but it is a nice to have, and I wish more systems would just give you this information because sometimes the BIOS keys will be different from different system. But overall, very nice size, very, very compact, very nice weight to it. Of course, on the back, we do have the power port. We have a full-size Ethernet port, two USB ports that do not seem to be 3.1, so just USB 2s, and we get two HDMIs. Personally, not the biggest fan of two HDMIs. I would have liked to have had at least one display port, but we will test out if that front USB-C is also display out. But of course, we can just plug it in now and boot it up to see how it actually ends up performing out of the box and see if there aren't any tweaks we can do to maybe improve the overall experience on it. We can, of course, test it out with some light games, loading in Valorant at the default setting. We can see here that with the power setting that we see here, it's set to around 15 watts. It's pretty much what the description on Amazon said it would be at. Really nothing too remarkable, but it is surprisingly power efficient. Pretty much with a game loaded up using a Wattman, I measured it around 18 to 20 watts while gaming. Really not too far off from what the TDP is set to. Overall, really, really nice and efficient. And the system was very, very quiet. So it seems like this is the tuning that it was really set to, and noise levels weren't bad. But you'll see here that the level of performance isn't spectacular. The averages are actually really nice. We're getting almost to 120 FPS average, but our 1% lows just being in the 30 range isn't exactly spectacular, but it's not an overall awful experience either. And really, I was pretty happy with the results here, but I was hoping that we would be able to tweak things a bit to try to squeeze out a bit more performance out of this, because 15 watts, which we'll see that it doesn't even really fully hit the 15 watts all the time. It's anywhere between 12 to 15 watts. But overall, the experience that we get out of it isn't remarkable, with FPS 1% lows being all the way into the 30s. It's not exactly the smoothest experience, not really the most perfect experience that you want out of an FPS game like this, but it is at least playable. And of course, switching over to Left 4 Dead 2, which is of course a much older game at this point now, but still a pretty popular one. I'm using it just to see what the performance would be like in a game that realistically would be playable on a system like this. You'll see that our 1% lows are pretty decent. Our TDP is now reaching all the way up to 18 watts. Not 100% sure why exactly this game was just using up more power, but nothing has been done at this point to try to adjust any power settings or anything like that. This was just how it was running out out of the box. So for at least for Left 4 Dead 2, it was using a bit more power. In terms of measuring from the wall, we're not talking about much of an increase either way. It's still barely going past 20 watts, going into maybe 21, 22 range. It would really just fluctuate a lot because gaming is not a 100% consistent load a lot of the times. There will be fluctuations. So because of that, the watt usage was kind of all over the place, but really it was all within a range of 1 or 2 watts from each other. So really not a huge increase in overall power being used here, but it was something that was more noticeable here, that the power usage was just a little bit higher. But overall, the gaming performance that we were getting out of this was really decent, with 1% lows being in the high 40s, pretty much meaning that our averages in the 80s were feeling absolutely buttery smooth. Very enjoyable overall to play like this. This is, of course, with the highest settings, but with AA set to absolutely off. No form of AA was being used here. You might want to turn it up a little bit. Personally, I didn't really feel the need to have any AA in this. But of course, I decided after this to see if we couldn't tweak things to try to improve the performance a little bit. Unfortunately, I really couldn't get a program like the AMD APU tuning utility or Ryzen control or any programs like that to work with this specific chip. It really seems to be such a niche chip itself that it really doesn't seem to have wide support in any of these programs. So because of that, none of the different presets would work or anything like that. Nothing would really change. It would all just stay at its stock TDP. Fortunately, the solution that I found was actually a relatively simple one. Really, you can see here that the CPU was not even clocking above 2 gigahertz when it was at around 80% utilization while downloading a game. So I started to mess around with some of the settings, specifically going into the power plan and just switching from the balanced power plan over to the high performance one was already more than enough to actually increase our performance here. You can already see in the task manager there that we're already clocking up to around 3.4 gigahertz. So overall, the improvement was very noticeable. You can just see there on the side of the task manager. And after checking it in hardware info 64 and an MSI afterburner, what this actually ends up doing is raising the TDP up to 25 watts from the 15 watts that it runs at stock. So it's actually a nice little bump in performance, and it really overall makes the gaming experience significantly better, and it salvages the overall performance that you can get out of this when you want to do gaming. And here you can see it running right next to a 5500U laptop. Now, of course, the 5560U is actually a radically different CPU compared to the 5500U. It is not just a refresh. You see, the 5500U is a Lucian-based CPU, which means that it is essentially running on Zen 2, while the 5560U is actually based off of Ryzen. So being based off of Ryzen is actually Zen 3, but it is different from the 5600U. The 5600U actually has around double the amount of cache compared to the 5560U. In terms of its cache configuration, it's pretty much just in line with the 5500U, so it seems to be a weird hybrid of both Zen 2 and Zen 3 CPUs. Another key difference is, of course, the fact that it actually has one less GPU core. It's running a Radeon 6 iGPU in comparison to the Radeon 7 that is in the 5500U. And the maximum clock of the iGPU camps out at 1600 in comparison to the 1800 that the Radeon 7 goes up to. Now, because the cache in the CPU is pretty much in line with the 5500U, you're going to see a little bit less improvements in there compared to what you would see with a full-on 5600U, because the improvements that came from the 5000 series in comparison to the 3000 series, or rather Zen 2 to Zen 3, mostly came from the cache improvements and the improvements in clock speeds. So losing those cache improvements pretty much only leaves the clock speed improvements to really give us any kind of an uplift. But surprisingly, even though it's running one less GPU core and it's using the same amount of cache as the 5500U, we are actually outperforming it by a slight margin, though really by no significant amount. The averages are really within a few FPS of each other, and the same result with the 1% lows. So really the biggest takeaway here is that there is no major impact being had from the reduction in cores in the GPU, and the CPU itself is, while not seeing a major improvement, at least in this specific game, it's not damaging the overall gaming experience in any way either. And this is, of course, with both chips running at the full 25 watt TDP. Now, of course, these are two completely different games. It's not exactly the one-to-one scenario, so it is a harder game to benchmark like this, but this is after multiple games, and the results are pretty much similar to each other like this. So really, there are no perceivable differences between the two chips, and that's not not necessarily a bad thing considering the price point that you can get this system for. And overall, the fact that we can actually raise the TDP up to 25 watts with the high performance setting is already a big improvement, and it really makes this game a lot more playable than where it was at the stock setting. Now, if we jump back to Left 4 Dead 2, we can start to see here that there are a little bit bigger differences, though it's mostly just in the 1% lows, but it's nothing that is too substantial. Now, this time around, we're going through around the same level, really just depending on a run-to-run variance at this point. But overall, the 1% lows are seeing a slight improvement with the 5560U, and this was relatively consistent throughout multiple runs, though I would be hard-pressed to say that it was really a huge game changer. I really wouldn't say that there was a super perceivable difference. Overall, it just felt slightly better to play it, and as you can see, both GPUs are reaching their maximum clocks in this one, though the 5560U is actually seeing some higher utilization here, where we're almost maxed out at 100% utilization, while the Radeon 7 is pretty much closer in line with a 90% utilization. And it might just have to do with the core itself here. And one thing you might notice here is that the 5560U is actually reaching some pretty high clock speeds in comparison to the 5500U. And more than likely, that's where the uplift in the 1% lows and the slight uplift in terms of averages is coming from, but it's nothing that's going to be too perceivable. So overall, while it's a nice improvement, it's nothing substantial, but it does mean that the game itself is extremely playable because our 1% lows are just a hair under 60 FPS, while with the 5500U, we were just slightly under 50 for our 1% lows. Again, not earth-shattering results, but it is at least a improvement considering the fact that we're dealing with one less GPU core and the clock speeds of the GPU itself are actually lower by 200 megahertz. So just to get a feel of what some of the differences are between the two CPUs alone, I decided to run Cinebench. Now, Cinebench is not the most accurate test for real-world results, but it is an easy way to do a comparison between just the individual CPU itself between the two. So after running both at the 15-watt stock TDP and the 25-watt TDP, you can see that there are some pretty noticeable difference. At the 15-watt TDP, the 5560U actually managed to pretty much have almost no difference in terms of performance between the 25-watt TDP. So really, whether you're at the stock setting or at the higher performance setting, you're already maxing out the CPU. Really, the extra TDP comes in handy when you're doing mixed loads that are loading up both the GPU and the CPU. But if it's just straight up using only the CPU, the stock 15-watt TDP actually gets you a lot of performance. Meanwhile, with the 5500U, what you can see here is that at the 15-watt TDP, there is a noticeable gap between the two, where the 5500U is just at a 5738 range. And this is after running the test multiple times and just getting an average of multiple runs. Now, the 5500U also does see a nice uplift going to the 25-watt TDP, where now we're at the 6456 range, but it is still noticeably behind where the 5560U is at both the 15-watt and 25-watt TDP. And this is really showing the most noticeable differences between Zen 2 and Zen 3, where the 5560U actually being on Zen 3 gives us a pretty nice performance uplift on the CPU side. Now, where does that really come in the real world? Well, it's not really that significant of a difference. If you're just doing day-to-day tasks, if you're just playing games and things like that, it's really most of the time not going to be that big of a deal because most games are going to have you being GPU limited more than CPU limited, and most tasks that you're doing on a system aren't really going to be utilizing the full 6 cores and 12 threads to the extent where this performance uplift is going to become really noticeable. Now, the single core test ended up being different in the sense that there was really no difference between the 15-watt and 25-watt TDP because we're just loading up one core, so it could pretty much just utilize all the power that it really needed. So the results that we got here don't really have as huge of a gap between the two, but there's still a noticeable uplift between the 5560U and the 5500U. Nothing Nothing super substantial here, but it does mean that overall on your day-to-day tasks, if you're just watching things on YouTube, loading up websites, things like that, they're going to be slightly better on the 5560U, but nothing substantial. But overall, it does show that there is at least some improvements with Zen 3 versus Zen 2 on the 5500U. Now, all of this has been very preliminary testing on this mini PC, but we're going to be going in depth later on. We're going to be doing a bunch of different videos testing this and comparing it to the 5500U on that laptop. But overall, I have been very, very impressed with the early testing that I've been doing on this specific system, especially for the price that I got it. If you're in the market for a system like this, I would keep an eye out for any Black Friday deals specifically for this system, because I expect this to go on sale for some pretty ridiculously low prices. And considering the IO that it has, you have a lot of flexibility on having both a home PC out of this or even a mini server. And while it's not a perfect setup, it is close enough to pretty much satisfy the vast majority of people. But I will see you guys next time when we actually go in depth on testing and comparing this to the 5500U.